Hello and welcome to Missouri Legislative Update. Today we start our show on the floor of the Missouri House of Representatives. In today's show, we take a look at several proposals moving through the legislative process. I'm Jonathan Lorenz reporting for the Missouri House of Representatives.
And from the upper chamber of the General Assembly, I'm Jennifer Yapel reporting for the Missouri Senate. The Senate affirmed two measures relating to the rights of gun owners in Missouri. Both measures now move to the House. Senate Communications Correspondent Brad Bayshore has the report on Senate Joint Resolution 36 and Senate Bill 613.
Nasheed. Nieves.
Senators recently gave final approval to Senate Bill 613, also known as the Second Amendment Preservation Act. Sponsored by Senator Brian Nieves of Washington, the bill lists various declarations of the Missouri General Assembly regarding the U.S. Constitution and the scope of the federal government's authority relating to the manufacturing, ownership, and use of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition. The bill would also lower the minimum age to get a concealed weapons permit from 21 to 19 and would prohibit law from requiring healthcare professionals to ask or document whether a patient owns a firearm. During lengthy debate, some questions were raised by Senator Jamila Nasheed of St. Louis regarding whether or not the legislation does anything to address the issue of gun violence and whether or not the bill would be challenged in court.
Can you cite any legal opinions or legal authority or even legal precedents that would show this bill has any chance of surviving in a court challenge?
Senate Bill 613 was later approved by a vote of 23 to 10 and moves to the House. Senate Majority Floor Leader Tom Dempsey of St. Charles says this year's version of the bill is different than legislation vetoed by the governor in 2013.
Specifically, it's been cleaned up and no longer has the language problems related to, publishing the names of gun owners, arresting law enforcement officers.
The Senate also gave final approval to Senate Joint Resolution 36, sponsored by Senator Kurt Schaefer of Columbia. If approved by voters, the constitutional amendment would define the right to bear arms as unalienable and require the state to defend against any infringement of that right, which also would include defending one's family with a firearm as a guaranteed constitutional right.
So basically what we're doing is taking what should already be the case and adding some language that makes sure that when any issue comes before a Missouri court, we are not predetermining the outcome of any fact pattern that may come before the court.
During debate, Senator Scott Sifton of Afton questioned a provision dealing with violent offenders and their gun rights.
I am concerned that there might be instances in which somebody who has been convicted of or pled guilty to certain misdemeanors, and I'll name one, for example, domestic assault. We may want to approach that differently.
The measure was later approved in the Senate by a vote of 29 to 4. If approved by the House, SJR 36 could go before Missouri voters in November. Reporting for the Missouri Senate, I'm Brad Bayshore.
The Missouri House of Representatives sent a proposal to the Missouri Senate aiming to ease the tax burden on Missouri companies. Supporters claim the legislation is all about growth, while opponents state the bill does more harm than good.
If we increase taxes in Missouri, will that help Missouri?
The Missouri House put its stamp of approval on a proposal aiming to reinvest in Missouri businesses. The proposal creates the Broad-Based Tax Relief Act of 2014. House Bill 1253 aims to reduce business income tax rates by 50% over a 5-year period. It also includes language reducing the corporate income tax rate from 6.25% to 3.125% over a 5-year period. These tax cuts only kick in if the state sees increased revenue.
What House Bill 1253 is about is incentivizing the creators so that we grow, and when they grow, I guarantee you, everyone else gets an opportunity also. Because who does employ people in the state of Missouri? It's business owners.
While the legislation aims to reduce the tax burden on Missouri job creators, it does create a hole in the state's budget. The legislation carries a fiscal note of more than $340 million per year.
By reducing general revenue, it severely undermines our state's ability to invest in education, public safety, and infrastructure. The fiscal note would end up at $347 million, but some groups have estimated that this fiscal note will be much higher in loss of revenue.
Following lively debate, lawmakers sent the legislation to the Missouri Senate with more than 105 yes votes. House Bill 1253 is the stripped-down version of House Bill 253 from last year, the same tax cut bill Governor Nixon vetoed in 2013.
Senators recently gave their final approval to a bill that would create a performance-based funding model for Missouri's 13 public colleges and universities. Senate Education Committee Chairman David Pierce of Warrensburg says the state has evolved when it comes to funding its higher education institutions, and nearly 30 states are moving to performance-based funding, as outlined in Senate Bill 492.
And Missouri should and could be in the mix to do that. And what this would do, it would make our universities efficient, and I think it would be a good way to evaluate our universities. A lot of this practice is being done, but this would actually codify that and put it in state statute. So long after we're gone, or the current commissioner of higher ed, or this governor's gone, these things will remain in permanent practice for performance funding for higher education.
The legislation would require the development of 5 institutional performance measures for each four-year institution, including student retention, graduation rates, student job placement, and the pursuit of a graduate degree. This performance funding model would be used as a matrix to determine where 90% of new funds appropriated by lawmakers are spent. Senator Shalom Kiki Curls of Kansas City says one of the main reasons lawmakers are discussing this higher education issue is due to the lack of preparedness for higher education of students throughout the state. She also shares her concern regarding the effect some performance measures would have on the state's historically black colleges and universities.
And I'm not saying that there are not some students that don't excel. I think we all know that, even in districts that happen to be struggling. But I think it poses a different challenge for the 2 HBCUs here in the state when we talk about some of these performance measures, and many times the field not being level way before they even get to the college level before we start determining these measures.
Senate President Pro Tem Tom Dempsey of St. Charles agrees change is needed in the way higher education institutions are currently allotted taxpayer dollars.
So I always thought there was merit to this debate about, can we come up with a more unified mission, and instead of spreading the butter evenly over the bread, have something that really had direction and had, where we had defined goals, and where we just didn't hand money out to areas of the state, based on, as I said, who the senators were from that area or what political deal had to be made.
We'll bring you more on this bill as it makes its way through the House of Representatives.
Lawmakers sent legislation to the Missouri Senate aiming to crack down on the abuse of prescription drugs. In this next story, we take a look at the efforts of lawmakers to stop the free flow of prescription drugs in the state.
All those in favor will vote yes.
The Missouri House put its stamp of approval on legislation creating the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program Act. House Bill 1133 requires the Department of Health and Senior Services to create a program to monitor the prescribing and dispensing of certain drugs in the state. Currently, Missouri is the only state in the nation without some sort of drug monitoring program.
It's taken down the amount of abuse. It's helped doctors prescribe. It's helped pharmacists. It's helped the seniors that go into an emergency room and they can't remember what medicines they're on.
The legislation does not contain a fiscal note because the sponsor claims grants will pay for the program. However, not everyone supports the bill. One former co-sponsor of the legislation claims the proposal takes the government to a place it isn't wanted.
I don't see black helicopters when I think of a database filled with prescription records from every law-abiding citizen in the state. I see another government overreach intruding on the rights and privacy of me and my neighbors.
Despite vocal objections, lawmakers approved the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program Act with more than 110 yes votes. The legislation now heads to the Missouri Senate for consideration. After the break, one of the state's top newsmakers sits down with a member of the Missouri House to discuss all things dollars and cents. That and more after the break on Missouri Legislative Update.
And when they grow, I guarantee you.
Hey! So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
Welcome to Capitol Dialogue. I'm Bob Priddy, and we're talking to T.J. Berry today, a state representative from Kearney. We're sitting in the House chamber as we talk about taxes today. And Representative Berry is one of those who is sponsoring, well, I've lost track of how many tax bills there are in this legislative session, but between you and the Senate, my gosh, there must be 10 or so, do you think?
I believe that you're probably correct. Maybe a couple less, but it's right there.
Which, if nothing else, gives you and your colleagues in the House, as well as the folks across the rotunda in the Senate, a lot of things to try to pick and choose from to come up with a single bill. Is that the goal, is to try to find one proposal that can move through the General Assembly this year?
I don't believe that that is.
Okay.
I think that after the State of the State last month that the governor had, and he said that no tax cut would come across his desk that he would sign, I think that the idea is we put several on his desk and hold him to his word.
He has indicated there are certain things that he would accept in terms of revenue growth before cuts are triggered. He's indicated he doesn't want to see anything that reduces or keeps the state from fully funding education. Are these viable requests that he has or demands?
Some of the things I think are. Being prudent is never a bad thing. And when we are dealing with the revenue of the state, we do need to be prudent.
Well, the main thing I hear from critics of tax cut bills this year is that we don't have any business cutting taxes when we're $600 million behind in school foundation formula funding. How would you answer that?
You know, that is a great question. I would answer that by saying that it is complicated. Let's first take the constitutional requirement. The constitutional requirement for the state of Missouri is that we spend 25% of all of our general revenue on education. We are currently spending well over 30% on education. So then the argument is, by statute, that the foundation formula, we are underfunding. If you look at court cases, 2010, the Supreme Court said to the Kansas City Symphony that they could not bind the hands of the legislation on how money is spent. So my question, I guess, back to you then is, if you were owed $650 million and you were the school districts, why wouldn't you have already sued for that money?
There have been various lawsuits, of course, that have occurred on school foundation funding. Mm-hmm. I guess, but getting to the point that you make about binding future legislatures, isn't that part of the problem with the foundation formula? Because it promised, it in effect bound your generation of legislators to fully fund this thing in so many annual steps to get to full funding. Because of the economy, the economic slide, that wasn't possible. But was that flawed from the very beginning?
It was flawed from the very beginning. If you go by the constitutional case, which was in 2010, it's very recently decided relatively in our state's history. And I believe that that's why the Constitution has the piece in it that we have to do at least 25%.
Now there's a bond issue proposal floating around that proposes to have appropriations bonds. Isn't that in the same category of binding the future legislatures to pay something off?
In some ways, I can get that argument, but bonds do end and they have to be reissued, or a new series has to be issued. So at that time you get the opportunity to review, where the foundation formula is not that way. It is always there and always growing.
We have this situation now where there are a lot of talk about tax reductions in various categories. There's talks about issuing or going into debt by the state for bonds to do this or that project, a series of projects. How do these two issues play out in terms of what you want to do with tax cuts? Do you have to, is there a balance, or is there a jeopardy of some kind to either one in this discussion?
There absolutely has to be a balance. If we do things improperly or don't think about our future, we do risk our future. But the argument that I would use for the tax cut, as long as it is for capital growth is a good thing. It grows the pie of our economy, and then we have more tax revenue. If it's about just economic growth and economic spending, then I would say that I would not be for a tax cut. And that's you have multiple bills that are going through the system, and some of them are about business and some of them are about personal income. The bills that I've sponsored have been all about business because that is where capital is created, that's where jobs are created, that's where the economy is created. And that's where I think we should focus.
In some ways, I kind of see some of these tax proposals the way people promote energy efficient refrigerators. If you buy an energy efficient refrigerator, you'll save enough on the energy use that it will eventually turn into a profit for you. Tax cuts eventually will turn into additional capital, additional tax income coming to the state. With my refrigerator, they tell me how many years it'll be before I turn that around.
Sure.
How long, for example, with your bill, will it be before the tax cuts you propose generate the additional revenue to more than offset what is being cut back?
That's why in my bills I've tried to make sure that we step into it over a period of time so that we are not decreasing the general revenue that we do have currently. And you'll have to look and you'll have to see the growth. And there are a lot of outside, a lot of different outside, the word I'm trying to use is factors that would affect growth. It isn't just one thing. And so if we had another recession, do you think that we would hit our growth targets? I don't think that we would. So being able to say you're going to get your bill repaid in 2 years, 4 months, 5 days, I can't do it.
Your bill has triggers. In other words, cuts won't go into effect until the income has grown to a certain level.
The difference between last year's bill, House Bill 253, and this year's bill is last year was all general revenue, all different sources, how it is. And as long as it grew $100 million, you would have a cut. This year is only personal income and business income. And if that does not grow, we don't cut. So that tightens it down a little bit.
Based on last year's experience with 253 and the veto and the attempt to override the veto that failed, what lessons did you learn that helped you write your bill this year in a way that you hope the governor will find more acceptable?
I believe that compromise is not a dirty word, and that the only way that we move together is by having conversations and listening to each other. So I went and I talked to the governor's office. I went and talked to the education communities. I went and talked to the individuals that voted against it and listened. And that's how I came to the place of creating this bill. And it's much, much smaller than last year's bill. Last year was at $1 billion general revenue, and that's fiscal note, and this year's is at $371 million.
Just get into some of the specifics. How much will you be cutting the individual income tax by over a period of how many years?
In this bill, it does not cut the individual income tax. This cuts business, subchapter S, LLC, and then corporate tax.
One of the criticisms of that approach is that it gives tax breaks to lawyers and lobbyists, but not to the people who have 5 employees so much.
You know, that was the most offensive statement that the governor made all last year. And I've owned and operated 4 different companies. They've all been S corporations. And I have employed, at the height, 10 employees, but very small business. And so I'm not a lobbyist, I'm not a lawyer. And 60% of all of the businesses in Missouri are either subchapter S and LLCs. I really wasn't aware that we had that many lobbyists and lawyers in the state.
When we return, Bob Priddy continues his discussion on tax reform with Senator Paul LeVota of Independence. Stay tuned.
9 out of 10 wildfires are caused by humans. If you see someone in danger of starting a wildfire, step in and make a difference. Because 9 out of 10 wildfires can be prevented.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
We move now to the Bingham Gallery of the State Senate to talk to Senator Paul LeVota from Independence. Taxes, the issue, again, on this part of the program. Nobody likes to pay them, but somebody has to do something to finance government, I suppose. Is the goal to have as few taxes as possible?
I think it is our goal, and I think our state is a low-tax state. We have a sensibility and a feeling that we should pay as low taxes as possible, as long as we have enough to pay for the things that we think are important, schools, roads, and those social services. And that's how we've been acting as a state for many years, and we've been competing fairly well with our surrounding states.
But do we pay enough taxes?
Well, you know, when we look at a budget situation where we don't fund education foundation formula and tuition keeps going up at our higher ed, there could be a case for more taxes to be paid. But I'm not a proponent of raising taxes at this time. I think that we can look at our budgets, we can look at our priorities and fund the things that we think are important. We never have that conversation at all in this legislature either. It's always a radical tax cut as opposed to continue the path that has made Missouri what we have been.
Now, I've heard the Democratic floor leader in the state Senate say that Democrats favor tax cuts, but, and that's the key word is but.
Mm-hmm.
What's the but?
Well, it depends on which tax cuts improve the economy and help growth. I have a bill that is gets rid of some deductions, and it actually would spread a tax cut to about 80% of Missourians. There you have more money in more people's pockets to stimulate the economy all the way through. The alternative that we see that we'll be debating soon in the Senate is a tax cut for pass-through corporations and the very wealthy, and that just puts more money in their pocket and dwindles our revenues.
But corporations create jobs, and jobs create people that earn income, and income creates taxes.
Well, you can say that as a fact, but we haven't seen that actually as it happened. As we've seen other states, our neighbor in Kansas, I'm from the Kansas City area in Independence, we've seen them cut taxes dramatically. We've seen their growth hasn't been as much as Missouri as far as jobs, and we see them suffering with trying to pay for those things that they think are important. We already are on a path where we don't fully fund our schools. So why would we take a radical approach just for some, I would call it a myth that this would create jobs, because it doesn't.
But people might say that Kansas has cut its taxes, and it takes time for this tax cut to then generate the additional income. So how much time are you going to give Kansas to prove that its tax cuts work or don't work?
Well, I have continually said in this tax cut debate that we need to continue to be the show me state, not the me too state. If Kansas wants to have a radical experiment, we need to watch them, see how it works before we try to dive in and do the exact same thing. So far it hasn't worked. There has not been any proof that it works, and why would we try the experiment when there hasn't been any benefit to their state?
But Kansas, with its tax cuts, is getting all of these jobs from Missouri, isn't it?
They aren't. They aren't. I mean, if you look at when Kansas was competing with us, it was because they were throwing incentives to different corporations to go across state line. They do not have the revenues to do that anymore, and you'll see that slow down a lot, and you'll see us be able to compete because we'll have better schools, better roads, and the things that actually make a business want to grow in a state.
Assuming, of course, we go along with your idea that we shouldn't cut taxes for corporations.
Well, I think we will, because you know, you saw that we had a radical tax cut bill last year. The governor vetoed it. It was sustained. The people of Missouri over the last summer said they want schools funded, they want roads being paid for, and I think the people of the state understand a common, show me, common sense idea that we need to pay for the things that are important to us.
Well, you mentioned the roads. That's a very key issue now. It has been for the last several years. What would you suggest is the way to make sure that we can build our roads and build our bridges and maintain the system we have, in addition to doing ports, airports, older adults transportation, stuff like that? Well,
the one thing that has been real frustrating in this General Assembly is that you have an $800 million tax cut and then a $1 billion tax increase on sales tax only for roads. So you would dwindle schools and other services, but then increase that when the talk is that tax cuts build our state, it's pick one and go with it. You know, we need to have a consistent tax policy. If we're going to invest in infrastructure, we can do that in different ways.
Can people look at campaign finance reports and determine who is behind various tax programs, including yours?
I think you probably could. I think you probably could see someone's philosophical thoughts on taxes by looking at who supports them.
So where do you think we'll be on May the 16th in terms of taxes this year?
My guess is that we will have a radical tax cut bill that will pass the legislature, that will be vetoed by the governor, and we'll have the same conversation again this summer with the people of Missouri. And the people of Missouri will be continually frustrated with the inaction of this General Assembly.
This is an election year. How did tax legislation play out in campaigns?
Well, you know, again, people in the state of Missouri want low taxes, but they also want their schools paid for, and they're going to support candidates who have a common sense approach to that.
But campaign rhetoric is going to focus on, I cut your taxes. It's not going to focus on, I made your schools better.
You know, if that was true, then I think we probably wouldn't have seen that veto override. You had school groups, parents, all kinds of folks from around the state last summer tell Governor Nixon that he did the right thing by vetoing a radical tax bill, and then tell the General Assembly that they need to sustain that veto. That was average Missourians who care about this issue, and I don't think this, I lowered your taxes, when the common Missourian will not see any bottom line off their taxes, only the people in the higher brackets.
If you were to bet right now on a transportation sales tax proposal, whether it comes through the legislature or comes in through a petition, will voters buy it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I keep going back to the idea that we say that we need tax cuts, but then we're going to ask the people for a tax increase. I think that type of inconsistent type of policy will make the people of Missouri question what is actually going on, and may result in that not being passed.
Now, a lot of people are trying to lump together a big bond issue for capital improvements with some kind of a tax for transportation, and maybe even not two separate bills, but some kind of a strange combination. Is that practical, do you think?
That could be practical. I mean, you know, we could get bonds inexpensive, and we could use that to invest in some of those things that really build the state. So that's a possibility.
It's going to be an awful lot for the voters to bite off, isn't it?
Absolutely. It will be.
How do you convince them?
Well, I'm not so sure I want to convince them. It may not be a good idea. So I think if people feel strongly about it, they're going to have to basically go door to door and talk to folks.
And that's our show for this month. If you have any questions about the legislation that appeared in this program, please visit senate.mo.gov. There you'll find the contact information for the 34 members of the Missouri Senate, as well as the Senate's newsroom website. I'm Jennifer Yapel reporting for the Missouri Senate.
And I'm Jonathan Lorenz reporting for the Missouri House of Representatives. If you have any questions regarding anything going on in the Missouri House, you can visit our website at house.mo.gov. February marked the first time the Honor and Remember flag flew above the state capitol. Designed by the parents of a fallen soldier, the flag aims to memorialize the sacrifice of all who have died while serving our country. Thanks for watching.